now we're tracking. All right, now we got it recording. So as I said, I'm really excited about the panelists we have. We're going to try to cover as much ground as possible from what anxiety and depression looks like in children, adolescents, teens, young adults, as well as how to help someone in your life that might be struggling with anxiety or depression, or some steps that maybe you can take as an individual. So a lot of information to cover, but why don't I open us up with a brief word of prayer, and then I will let the panelists introduce themselves. God, our belief is that you care about every part of us, from our minds to our bodies to our souls, and we just pray that you would use this time to help us become better people. God, we pray that you would help us to see things we didn't see, and to grow both in maturity and care and compassion. Let's pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So once again, welcome to this online panel about specifically anxiety and depression. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, who they are, and kind of what perspective they bring to the table. So, Amy, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I'm Amy Breza, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've been licensed since 2010, and my early clinical work focused mostly working with children as young as age 3 through grade school, adolescents, teenagers, doing cognitive behavioral therapy with them, doing parent coaching and family therapy. Currently, I'm the Children's Ministry Director with Grace Ann Arbor, and I also work with BetterHelp, where I do telehealth, so counseling for adolescents and adults using that platform, which is phone and video-based.
Thanks, Amy. Jennifer?
Hi,
Yeah, go for it.
I'm Jennifer Tang. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I am a director of a group practice here in Ann Arbor called Everwell Health and Counseling Services. And I work with adults as well as children. And our vision is to provide kind of culturally sensitive and diversity affirming therapy that's rooted in evidence-based therapies, which we'll talk about what evidence-based therapies is in a little bit. And I am also a member at Grace Church and a community group leader.
And hello, I'm Tom Waltz. I am a professor at Eastern Michigan University. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist. I've done clinical work in community mental health. I've done work in the Department of Veterans Affairs, both as a clinician and as a researcher. And I do clinical supervision here at our university-based clinic, as well as some of our students who are practicing in the community.
Thanks. And my name's Nate. I am one of the pastors at Grace Church, and Grace Church is the organization that's hosting this panel. But I think that there's going to be things for anyone, whether you're coming from a perspective of faith or not. Our hope is really to provide you the best information and the most amount of resources we possibly can, regardless of your, where you're at right now. So with that said, I think I'd like to start with some definitions. Kind of like, let's start with a common vocabulary about, for some of the things we're going to be talking about. Really basic, but can one of you tackle, when we talk about mental health, if that's the big umbrella that all of this is under, how might we define that? You're also polite.
I think any of us could jump in. I think there's so mental health broadly is, how are you doing? Both with yourself and your interactions with your community. And one of the common threads that is way of identifying how you're, the severity with which you're struggling is how much do those struggles interfere with your everyday activities, with your everyday relationships. And so regardless of whether those struggles might kind of meet some of the other criteria for like depression or anxiety or some of the other kind of clinical names we give things, what we're really concerned about is no matter what kinds of struggles we're having, how much are those interfering with our everyday life activities. I don't know if...
Yeah, that's a great point, Tom. I like to call it like whether it's big D or little d depression, you know, like does it meet kind of the clinical criteria where you're giving a screener and being like, okay, here's this particular number and you meet major depressive disorder, or we experience some depressive symptoms where we feel hopeless or a sense of despair, or things that we used to be interested in we're no longer interested in, or because we're so worried it's affecting our sleep. You know, we're kind of looking at from the lens of, you know, it just impacts our functioning, it's impacting our work, our relationships, those kinds of things.
I love that framework. It's very individual, isn't it? I think it's helpful for people to understand that it's not about meeting some sort of definition. It's literally saying, like you said, you know, Tom, is it impacting these relationships? If so, then that's something that we want to take a look at. We're specifically talking about anxiety and depression. Jennifer, you mentioned big D, little d. Can you explain that a little bit further?
Yeah, because, you know, when we're therapists and we're meeting with clients, or, you know, you meet with a psychiatrist or anything like that, sometimes people might want to know what their formal diagnosis is, and that's when we talk about those screeners, where you might be like, okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, or how likely or how often these are happening, you know, those would be kind of the clinical depression or clinical anxiety. But really, as Tom was saying, you know, like I like to kind of think about it as how much are these things impacting our day-to-day, impacting our functioning, our relationships, those kinds of things. Because at the end of the day, that's kind of what we're targeting, right? If for anxiety, we have persistent worries or difficulty making decisions, or with depression, if you're feeling a sense of hopelessness, you're losing interest in things, or you decrease in motivation, those would be the things we want to target more so, rather than kind of seeing as like, okay, is it kind of formal depression or not? And I think that's helpful for our participants to be aware of. You know, I know when people come and see me for therapy, they're like, am I supposed to be here? I'm not sure, you know, and I was like, it doesn't really matter, you know, if you need kind of like a formal diagnosis per se. It's helpful. It helps frame the care that we give. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we just target the things that are impacting you, right?
So what might be a specific example of like little d depression?
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of us probably have experienced some form of that in these last few months with this pandemic, you know, whether it's struggle with changes in work, or some people have lost their work, or feeling kind of this despair of like, when is this going to end? When am I going to go back to normal? You know, our relationships feel strained. I don't feel as connected with other people. So I think that could be any kind of situation like that, you know.
So a little bit more circumstantially driven versus something that might be chemical, or is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. Though I think some people can be kind of, I guess, could be the big D depression, you know, major depressive disorder, just from kind of a lifelong experience of maybe having a maladaptive home life growing up or something like that. You know, I think that can still impact our mental health.
One of the challenges can be is sometimes the stressors we've experienced, we were so used to them that we actually don't understand how they have impacted us for the long term. So if you've been under chronic stress for a long time, and as a result, maybe the way you live your life may have gotten kind of smaller and smaller over time, and you find yourself kind of feeling depressed, it might not be obvious to you how your life is kind of shifted and shrank over time. And so one of the attributions that people will make, well, maybe there's just something chemically wrong with me. Well, in the sense that our biology comes with us no matter what we do. Like there's always those types of changes that are occurring. But it's not the same as saying that you have some type of imbalance or that can only be addressed through a medical intervention. In fact, the National Institutes of Mental Health have actually pulled away from supporting research that has worked from that framework because they haven't had very much success at all in trying to promote research that way. So they're actually been shifting gears since about 2014.
So I want to also dig a little deeper into the definition of anxiety, but I want to reiterate, if you're just joining this panel, welcome. I'm glad you're here. If you have questions, you can type them into the chat, and we will really try to tackle them in the flow of the conversation or address them towards the end of our time together. Or there's a Q&A feature. You can also take advantage of that, but we'd love to answer any questions you might have. So Amy, can you maybe flesh out for us what a working definition of anxiety would be for the
Yeah. Yeah, so we all experience worries, and thinking of anxiety on a continuum. So we have worries, we have stressors that will impact us and maybe draw our attention to something. Sometimes we talk about our gut, or that feeling in us that kind of makes us a little worried that we want to think through that next step. And when it may move more towards where you're thinking of anxiety, where it's a problematic in your life, is when you almost find it on a loop, that worry just continues on a loop and continues to interrupt your ability to function, that you're almost dwelling in that place that is sending you kind of in that spiral.
So Jennifer, you talked a little bit about what depression might look like. Could we take a minute again to address that? Let's imagine from the perspective, if I have a close family member that I'm afraid is struggling with depression, what might I be observing?
What was the end of that question?
What might I be observing in someone that's close to me that's struggling with depression?
Yeah, you probably notice that they're kind of pulling away more, like if you usually used to do a lot of things together and then they've been canceling a lot, or maybe not returning phone calls or messages. Depending on how close you are, if you're noticing that they're sleeping a lot more or they're sleeping a lot less. Same with diet. Again, if they're eating a lot more, eating a lot less than they typically have been. And these would be kind of ongoing, like longer than 2 weeks is usually the benchmark for something like that. And they're kind of sounding like a sense of hopelessness. Some people might not clearly say like they're suicidal, they have a plan, but maybe they might say things like, sometimes I wish I never woke up, I wish I was dead, those kinds of thoughts still would be probably some depressive thoughts in nature.
I have 4 teenagers, so I'm like, oh, okay. I can see that would probably look like that for a teenager. What about for children or somebody that's much younger? Do you have any thoughts on how it might be different?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So for children, when you're thinking about, I'm going to break it down into a couple. With preschool, you're going to notice more of a regression. So regression maybe in sleep or potty training. Maybe they're starting to use baby talk. Maybe you're starting to notice that they don't want to play with their favorite toys or with peers. They're aggressive, a little more aggressive or sluggish. And same with even adults, you may notice changes in their eating or sleeping habits. With grade school, they may become a little more verbal with what they're experiencing. So you may begin to hear more of that general negative outlook on life that they're articulating. You'll also see some of that loss in interest of some of their favorite activities, or lacking motivation and things that they typically would enjoy. You'll also start seeing more physical complaints. So noticing stomach aches, headaches, complaining of aches and pains that don't seem to be related to anything else. And you mentioned, teenagers and, that they may carry some of those same symptoms, but also noting with teens developmentally, they're going to isolate more from family and parents. That's just like part of their developmental stage. But when they're also isolating and not wanting to engage with friends, that may be something else you want to take note of.
That's a good distinction. That's a good distinction. What
I
about?
actually want to add quickly too.
Yeah.
Made me think too. Like a lot of the things that we study about depression, anxiety, it comes from a more Eurocentric a point of view, and so it's helpful to think about, like, sometimes the way depression and anxiety can manifest differently across culture too. So I think sometimes, I know, for example, Asian culture, they might not be as comfortable saying like, oh, I feel sad, or that kind of thing, but there might be more of the somatic complaints, so more physiological, like you were saying, like the stomach aches or headaches, those kinds of things might manifest more so. And also like anger and irritability could actually be a sign of depression. And same thing with even concentration. Sometimes it looks a little bit like ADHD, but it actually could be depression in nature.
So what about anxiety? What type of things might someone notice in themselves or in someone else if anxiety is an issue that they need help?
Are you saying kind of like across culture, you're saying?
Yeah. Like what might be some markers of anxiety? Go ahead, Tom.
Say you'll see a couple different, sometimes we talk about them as channels, in the sense that you might have kind of a worry cognitive side of anxiety, where you're kind of thinking about things repeatedly, often, and not necessarily feeling like that thinking is resulting in effective problem solving, but instead you feel like the worry kind of builds, and you may even feel like you have to keep worrying because the worrying kind of is how you kind of keep a lid on things. But there's also somatic components, very common to have sweating, heart racing, and many people actually will present to the emergency room secondary to having kind of chest pains and a racing heart and feeling like it won't stop. So there's that kind of somatic side that many people experience, as well as the more cognitive worry side of things.
I'll share just briefly personally that much of my life, as you're describing these symptoms, I mean, so I've known for much of my adult life that anxiety has been an issue. I realized I had stomach aches for most of my childhood. That's one of the primary things that I remember about being a kid. So to hear that that's like a symptom of anxiety, I'm like, oh, that checks out, that checks out. And I remember I was talking to my brother-in-law one time, and I was like, yeah, I was in a job that wasn't a good fit, and I was like, yeah, man, it's the craziest thing. At like 4 a.m. I wake up every morning and my heart's kind of racing and I can't really go back to sleep. He's like, hey man, that sounds like you might be having some anxiety or like a panic attack. And I was like, really? I mean, I was having these physiological responses that I was not keyed into being all tied to like the same group. So it's helpful to remember that it doesn't always present in kind of like a cognitive worry, but that our bodies can actually be telling us something that we're not quite picking up on yet in our minds. So let's talk about what do we start to do here? If you recognize that you have, and I think many of the people on this call are here because they've acknowledged that depression or anxiety is a reality of their life or of their mental landscape. What are some of the first steps that we can see people start to take?
So
yeah, go ahead.
I'll jump in.
So
I think one of the things that is probably most helpful and also least intuitive, it has to do with what we call behavioral activation. And what that has to do is often when we're experiencing depression in particular, we get put in a mindset where, like, if I feel better, then it's okay for me to do better. But while I'm feeling poorly, I'm going to kind of batten down the hatches, lock down, and kind of wait for the storm to pass. And many times during life, that actually works. We have a bad day, we have a bad event, and we can kind of weather the storm. After, you know, a few hours or a few days, it passes and we bounce back. But if you find yourself to where you're feeling stuck in that space, if you wait and say, I'm not going to take action to do things that are meaningful to me until I feel better, that's a trap. And so the most counterintuitive thing to do is to actually identify things in your life that matter to you, and schedule time to engage in those, at least some every day, and kind of try to start expanding your life space a little bit more and doing things that are meaningful. I think that's one step, but there's plenty of others for people to jump in on.
Absolutely. I think also taking into account just regular self-compassion and self-care. So, you know, diet can impact us, exercise, talking to loved ones, and, you know, engaging, like Tom was sharing, you know, the things that we enjoy, engaging in those, but also being aware of our physical needs like sleep and food and exercise, you know, that those are also very important aspects to just be in tune and aware of.
Yeah, to give a little bit of a background too, like where some of these tools are coming from, there's a type of therapy that a lot of people might look into called cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT for short. I like to draw out like a little triangle for folks, and mean that our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors are interconnected. So, you know, if you're feeling down, for example, you're feeling sad, your thoughts might be like, nobody likes me, my life is worthless. And then the behavior is you avoid, you don't want to do anything, you don't want to talk to people, which might make you feel more sad. So usually we can't change how we feel, right? If you tell yourself stop being angry or stop feeling sad, we can't do that as easily. So a lot of these strategies are looking to changing the behavior, like Tom and Amy were talking about, or also kind of looking at reframing our thought patterns. So those are kind of like where some of these tools are coming from. And so definitely the behavior activation, or changing some of the behaviors. Like I like to draw like a little grid for folks, so that there are these 4 types of categories that we try to do some of in each of our day. You know, could be varying amounts, but like the self-care piece that Amy talked more at length about. There's also what's called mastery tasks, so kind of the necessary to do chores or responsibilities, but there's also pleasurable and there's social, so things that we enjoy doing or things that we're feeling connected with other folks. I like to break that down with folks, because sometimes we feel the burden, especially in Ann Arbor, right, where there's such an education, there's this kind of necessary to do, or we always have to kind of study or do something, that we focus so much on the master task, but so much of our mental health can be impacted if we make time for more pleasurable activities, the self-care activities, and the social connection.
So what would you say to someone who feels like that's a little bit like fake it till you make it sort of a setup, or that it's like not being like true to yourself? Or how do you help someone bridge the gap between that feeling to actually starting to take some healthy steps?
So when I talk with people, I say there's a lot of things we do every day that we don't feel like doing. Like sometimes it's just getting up in the morning, sometimes it's having to engage in kind of a lot of routine activities. There's a lot of things that we do that we don't necessarily feel good about when we do. And it's like, if I was true to myself, I would stay in bed for another hour.
That's right.
Right? But instead, it's important to kind of back up a bit and say, like, what do I want my life to be about in a much broader sense? And so I want to be able to contribute to my community. I want to have these types of relationships. And so in doing so, I'm often doing things that in the moment aren't exactly like what I feel like doing, but they are part of who I want to be in the world and how I want to interact with others. And so I think when it gets really challenging is when you're in a situation where you don't feel like you have a lot of pressures to do a lot of things, but you don't feel connected to them. And then that's a much different situation. And so I encourage people to try to honor themselves and how they feel, but not just in the moment, but how they want to feel in the long term is how they interact with others. And does this actually fit in with your values? Even if in this moment, it's kind of a hard slog to get through.
Yeah, that's great. That's such a good perspective. Sometimes just taking that step back can let us see, in my own experience, again, and I don't want to dwell too much on that, but like, especially if I'm in the depths of anxiety, my focus is like, it's like a pinpoint, and I can lose perspective on all of those things that you're saying. Who do I want to be? What kind of a husband do I want to be? What kind of a father do I want to be? And all I can think about is I can't stop thinking about X, Y, or Z. And taking a couple steps back and seeing the broader picture can kind of help pull me out of that at times. That's really helpful.
Just to build on what Tom was saying, I think it's easy to think about the things that would make our life more enjoyable or the things that we want to add to lead towards those goals. But I think it's also looking at, what do we need to take away? What are we doing in our life that other people are putting pressure on us for, that we're trying to meet their expectations? Or, maybe there's tasks in our life that we feel the need to accomplish, but when we really look at it, is that gearing us up for who we want to be or what we're becoming? Are they necessary? And beginning to prune away some of those things.
So one of the questions that we got, and we tend to get in these type of conversations, is how do you help someone who might not be aware that they are in a place of anxiety or depression? How do you help a family member who you might observe as, expressing kind of depressive behaviors, but they wouldn't necessarily call themselves that? How do we step into that?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I feel like if we kind of hit it head on, I think if people get defensive typically, so they might be like, I'm not depressed or I'm not anxious. But I think kind of tying it back to, like, can you notice some changes? Are you, I guess checking in, are they satisfied with where their life looks like right now? Like, are you okay? Like, sometimes, like, we talk about sleep, right? Like, if people who are depressed might not sleep a lot more. At the same time, if you're like, hey, you need the sleep to restore, that might be an important behavior. But if you're like, oh, like, because I sleep so much, I miss deadlines, I'm getting in trouble with work, or my family's getting upset with me that I'm not spending time with them, then you might be like, okay, then how do we go from there? Kind of engaging, I guess, how for them to kind of see how it's impacting their lives.
My initial thought went to children, and thinking about when you recognize that a child is experiencing anxiety or depression, you don't begin educating that child on, you have anxiety or you have depression. You don't tell them what they're experiencing. Instead, you're validating what you see. It seems like you're feeling upset about what happened earlier, or you seem to be crying a little bit more. Can you tell me what's going on? Seeking to understand and then validating the difficulties that they're having, so that they know that you see them, they know that you hear them, and then you could begin almost teaching them those coping skills without ever telling them what it's for. Teaching them how to breathe and asking them, well, how do you feel right now? And then they're telling you how they feel, and then you kind of walk them through a mindfulness exercise or a breathing technique, and then you ask them afterwards, how do you feel now? And they can begin to see where they feel different, that their stomach is less tense, or that they just feel more calm. They can acknowledge that. And so almost like adults, you don't have to point out, I see you're depressed and I'm concerned for you, but you can point out some of what you notice in a loving and compassionate way, and validating what they're going through.
I think that's a great point about the validation, or even just kind of like helping sit with someone in what they're experiencing. I think so often we're quick to think about, like, what are the solutions, how do we tackle the problem, what are the strategies, and sometimes people just need a space to feel heard and feel seen.
Another strategy that is often successful is to take some moments and talk with a person about kind of positive aspects of your relationship and how you used to have kind of more of that. So you kind of touch on the strengths that you've had together, and noticing that it's been harder to connect in some ways, and that you do value that connection. And so you kind of start with that kind of warm bonding side of kind of mental wellness, and then talk about, somehow, it seems that we've kind of fallen out from being able to have that as often as we used to. And I would really like for us to get back there. And you're opening the door to that conversation for the other person, maybe saying, yeah, I noticed that maybe I feel less connected, or I feel, many different ways, and they open up to you a little bit more.
So on the other side of that, when would we as non-professionals need to know that we're in over our heads, and with someone that we care about, what they need is beyond what we can provide? Like, it's past the point of simply, kind of that initial support or presence.
I'm a big fan of telling people never be afraid to get a coach. Because that's really how I think the best way to make use of therapy is to think about it as you're hiring a coach to help you get back in the game, and the game is your life. And you may feel like you've been sidelined or penalized, or whatever other kind of metaphor you'd like to have. But you really go there to get coaching to help you kind of be more of you and what you want to bring to the world. And I think when you talk about interacting with treatment that way, rather than like, you're screwing up and you're doing bad, and so though you gotta go see a professional, that makes it sound like nobody goes into this profession thinking that that's what their role is. We have much more of a coach mindset to how we approach things than a prison guard.
Yeah, one of our attendees said that speaking of it that way eliminates some of the shame that people might experience behind seeking support. Any other thoughts about how we know when we're in over our head? I mean, this is helpful for some of us.
I think, go ahead.
I think looking at some of the things that you used to enjoy, like if you really take inventory of your life and look, where was I 3 months ago or even a year ago? Am I doing the same things that I used to enjoy? And if I'm not, then why am I not? Did my interest shift, or, am I feeling down? And I think it's okay to also ask those around you, asking your spouse or a friend, or someone you trust in your life, say like, hey, I'm just feeling a little different. Have you noticed anything? And if you're willing to have that conversation with them and receive that, then now you have someone who can walk alongside you in that journey of accountability to seeking out a coach. And you have that accountability maybe after you've transitioned even out of therapy for a season.
Yeah, I like to think of it as like, when we go to our physician, right? It's like a kind of, we can see it as like a preventative care as well, right? And it's not that we have to get to like this breaking point or you reach this level of severity that we need to seek more intensive of care in some regard, kind of like what Tom was saying. I kind of see my role more as like a personal trainer, like a kind of strength base. Like some people can work out on their own, some people may benefit from working with someone who can help give them some additional tools or suggestions. But ultimately, like I don't like to see myself as the expert or the person doing all the work. The individual is kind of building up their own tools and their own strengthening themselves.
Yeah, the last thing that oh, go ahead, Tom.
I would say it's also important to know that people come in seeking help, and sometimes they're actually looking for more of what we call a brief tune-up. rather than like, a major overhaul, or, I'm really stuck. I don't know in multiple areas in life, and I have kind of no idea where to go or what to do. We're happy to work with folks who are in that position, but folks who have just feel like they're new to being stuck and need coaching. We're happy to work, and we're not going to say, while you're here, why don't we redo everything? That's not how treatment contracts work. We actually work with people on their personal goals, and work with you, collaboratively to identify kind of where you are in life and what is a meaningful set of objectives for you at this time.
That's good. The last thing I wanted to mention around the issue of support was that, again, full disclosure, one of the most helpful things my wife ever did for me was that she set up my first appointment with a therapist. I kind of felt like, look, I just am not sure that I can actually make this call. And she did it in about 10 minutes. She was motivated. But again, it's been tremendous. It's been tremendous for me. And that was a very easy way for her to support me. So we've started to kind of drift into the area of like, entering into a relationship with a therapist. I will say that one of the biggest barriers for me in the beginning was just not quite understanding how that worked. And, so Tom, you've talked a little bit about contracts and, tune-ups versus overhauls. Can you help give us some framework about, when should we seek help, and what are some of the, how do we take that first step?
So there are actually a lot of things to think about, actually. I think early on, even before you go to see a therapist, it's actually, when's the last time you had a primary care checkup? Are you generally healthy? I think one of the biggest fears as a psychologist that I have is if somebody presents with some concerns and they haven't had a primary care checkup to make sure their thyroid functioning is okay, that they're not having any, if they're on medications, if they're having any medication side effects that might be influencing their mood, behavior, sleep, if they have vitamin D deficiencies, vitamin B12, those types of kind of physical health things, you should make sure that those systems are in check. And then there's different levels of engagement with the care system. There's self-help books, and we can actually kind of send some links to some websites where people curate some evidence-based self-help that many people find that level of coaching effective for them, and they're able to take meaningful steps. Other folks actually benefit from the face-to-face component of the coaching. And so then if kind of going from a book doesn't seem to fit for you, or you've tried that and it just wasn't personal enough for you to get traction, then reach out kind of for a coach. And I think that's the once you've reached to that level, then people will help you able to navigate the system even further if that's necessary.
We're getting some really good questions here that I do want to make sure that we take time to address. But I just wanted to also throw it over to Amy and Jennifer. Any other things that you would want people to know in terms of saying, hey, if this is where you're at, it's probably time to reach out, and this might be a first step to take.
Again, thinking about children, if kids are saying that they're thinking of hurting themselves, or if they've engaged in any self-harm behavior, maybe they're having some suicidal ideation, I think those are steps that the adolescent or the child doesn't, like, the parent then makes the choice to initiate that therapy. Even something like an eating disorder, we know that if treated early is going to at best impact their outcome with that. And so there's some things that we don't wait on. We don't want to wait on getting children or adolescents a life coach or therapist, and that would be one of them.
Yeah, and in my mind, I think that to any degree we can benefit from therapy. Whether it's like someone's like might be struggling, like they could be extremely high functioning. I'm successful. I have a job. I'm happily in relationships, but I'm feeling particularly stuck and finding some enjoyment in my life. I think that person can still benefit from therapy or self help or further processing about the things they're experiencing, just as much as someone who might be like, I've been struggling so much so that I've missed meetings and then therefore I got fired. I have difficulty finding jobs, or my friends are cutting me off because they haven't heard from me for a while. That person could also benefit from therapy. So I think in my mind that if people find that this is just another tool that they can try out.
So one of the questions that one of our attendees put out there is that she said, I'm noting my parents have depression. They're in their 80s. With COVID, they can't do anything and they physically can't do much. How do we love on the elderly? And we've talked about children and adolescents. How is it different when someone is really limited in their capacity to do things?
So creativity has to come in. Now, some of the things get really difficult. So for example, depending on whether or not the parents are good with technology is the degree to which you can do what we're doing right now, is have video social interactions. And you might have to spend some time, figuring out, okay, what technology, if I have resources, is there a technology I can bring them in contact with that will help them? Telephone is nice. Being able to see someone does matter quite a bit. And I know that a lot of folks that I'm connected with have worked really hard to make sure they could digitally connect with the elderly during this time, so they were both safe and have some level of social connection. And it does take sometimes some patience to be able to do technical support, especially since they will often look at technology with very fresh eyes. And as a result, you might be challenged to problem solve in ways you never had to think of because of all the assumptions you already have with interacting with technology.
We tried. My grandmother is in assisted living and she's in her mid 90s, and we set her up on FaceTime saying like, look, when your iPad starts ringing, all you need to do is push the green button. And she pushed the green button and then immediately held it up to her ear. And so all we had was like a view of her cheek. Like it's different. It takes patience and it takes training. But for her, especially being stuck inside, she didn't leave her room for months because of COVID. And so it's critical for those type of connections to take place, as difficult as they can be.
Another thing people have seen, if you can get the video connection going, you can have board games sometimes where you can actually have one board game on the other side and you're playing the same one and do fun social interactions that way.
I appreciate your perspective also, Tom, saying that you just have to be creative, and there are lots of things from music to, paint by, there are ways to be, for people to live in some of those boxes that you talked about, Jennifer, even if they can't physically go out somewhere. It's a good perspective.
Yeah, I'll quickly add too, sometimes I work with one client who has like a diminishing physical capacity. And so sometimes just even helping them think about fond memories and kind of really kind of describing them and fleshing them out. One strategy we might talk about later is mindfulness, but kind of really just bringing ourselves to a place where we can kind of, especially if it's like something that either is a sense of accomplishment or something that's like a positive memory or something that's relaxing, and helping them kind of share that. And especially if it's a family member, and they might recount stories that as a family member we might not have heard before, but it might help their mood kind of recounting those things.
Yeah, before we leave the conversation about therapists specifically, one of our attendees asked, how would you select the right therapist? You guys have thoughts on how someone can know if it's a good fit?
Pretty much, it really just boils down to the feeling that you have when you sit with that person. A lot of times just a lot of times when I ask people, I'm like, well, you've seen a few therapists in their past, or they moved around and, you know, they got to me. It's like, what was helpful about that person versus the other one or whatever? And a lot of times they're like, I'm not really sure. It's like, just, I felt comfortable with them or whatnot. So I think that's kind of at the end of the day, what it comes down to. For the people who kind of like researching a little bit more or having some sort of application to it, there are maybe different types of therapy modalities that might resonate with you more or less. Again, these are all technical terms, so you don't have to worry about them, again, if you want to just figure out the fit. But the technical terms would be like, you know, there's someone who's more psychodynamically trained, might focus more on exploring kind of our past experiences and our relationships and how that shaped our lives, and finding more insight and awareness on that can bring healing. People who might like kind of the CBT that I was talking about kind of the more present focus, working tools and strategies on changing the way we think or changing our behaviors. Some of the things Tom was talking about, like identifying our values and finding meaning and focusing on that. And that would be more acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT. So there's a couple of different routes you can take, but really I think it's kind of about sitting in the room and seeing how you feel when you're with them.
And I think it's important to note that therapists and clinicians, we don't get our feelings hurt if it's not the right fit for you. Like, what's most important to us is that you're getting the help and care that you feel like you need. And that's what we want to see and help you with on your journey. So if you see a therapist in a group practice, there may be someone within that group that's a better fit for you. And sometimes a therapist may even bring that up as well, you know, saying like it, you know, someone else in the practice has more expertise in the area you're describing. I'd like to introduce you. You know, that's also a possibility. So, yeah, we don't get our feelings hurt by that.
That's good. That's good to know. Another question that I think is a really good one, and we're moving a little bit more into like, what are some regular practices or habits that we can engage in? One of our attendees said, Tom mentioned something about figuring out if you're engaging in activities or behaviors that are consistent with your values, which I think is what you were just referring to, Jennifer. And then she says, I often have a really hard time distinguishing between values and obligations and find the two blur together sometimes and wind up feeling frustrated. Is this common, or how does one identify one's values?
Good question. I think sometimes our obligations overlap with our values in really neat and tidy ways, which makes things very convenient. And sometimes they overlap in very complicated ways, to where we would value it if we didn't feel like everybody was requiring us to do it every moment of the day, or at intervals or in ways that don't quite match for us. So I think it's really useful to spend time identifying what is it that I actually value within my obligations, and how do my obligations sometimes stray from that part that I really value. And that's not always easy to work out. And you usually have to go into the specifics to kind of figure out what is it in that value, and what part of that obligation is something that you are willing, even if it's heavy, you're willing to carry it because it's actually part of what matters to you, and which parts would be really great to hand off to someone else who might find that part something they don't find as heavy to carry.
That's good. And I think that is one of the places where having a coach can make a tremendous difference. Someone who can provide some outside perspective or ask you those questions that lead you to those realizations. I just am reading a book by a gentleman named Parker Palmer, and he talks a lot about vocation. And one of the things that he said is that he found in all the areas of his life, there was a common thread. Regardless of what else he did, he always found himself teaching. And he realized that whatever else he was doing, teaching was the value that went through, and that would be a way where he would know, oh, this is what brings me life, even though it happened in all sorts of different contexts. Teaching was the thread. So that's a good perspective.
Another thing that's complicated is of a lot of the things that we think of as values are often things that have been imparted to us by the communities we participate in. And so there's often a sense of what you ought to value as opposed to what you kind of if everybody else wasn't, watching you in this moment, what would you kind of value with your own heart and your own behavior? And sometimes those things will line up to where what your community has kind of taught you to value will actually be something you feel like you can personalize. There'll be times in your life where you're feeling like, no, I'm just kind of complying with what the expectations are for me. But over time in your life, you might actually find a way to actually own it in a way that feels true to you rather than something that's just hoisted upon you. And so it's a really complicated journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Amy or Jennifer, did you have any other thoughts on that topic? Covered? Great. So one thing that I did want to touch on, and this was a part of some of our pre-panel conversations, but when should somebody look at medication as an option if they're struggling with anxiety or depression?
So we don't have any physicians on the panel. No, so none of us are actually qualified to prescribe. However, I can talk broadly both about the research and some of our cultural assumptions. So one of the assumptions is that if somebody is struggling with something that's labeled a disorder, then it requires medical intervention. And there are for sure people who do benefit from for the medications that target things like anxiety and depression. But what's really important is to make sure that you're actually tracking your personal progress towards things that matter to you if you start a medication trial, and also track whether or not you're experiencing negative side effects. Because these medications often come with costs. Not everybody experiences negative side effects. And so some people kind of are really lucky. The body metabolizes things well. They don't have the negative side effects. So for example, antidepressants, most of the selective serotonin and reuptake inhibitors that are out there, if they're categorized by their primary effect on physiology, they actually inhibit sexual desire more reliably than anything else they do. But they don't do that to everyone. But for some people, if you're already experiencing depression and that's a vibrant part of your relationship, then that can create additional stressors. So it's really important for you to understand or carefully monitor, how do these medications actually work for you? Similarly, some of the things that might be prescribed for anxiety that reduce anxiety acutely, like benzodiazepines, they can disrupt sleep for longer periods of time, and you can also get what's called rebound anxiety, to where if you try to get off those drugs, the anxiety escalates. So it's really important that if you're going to check out medications, you're actually working with a team of people that help you monitor your progress, and so you can really track how the costs and benefits are working out for you.
Thanks, Tom. One of our attendees asked, what about as needed medication, where a person just needs it once in a while, such as presentation anxiety?
Yeah, those are usually benzodiazepines. And they're known for, I'm going to come off really hard on drugs today.
We'll ask Amy and Jennifer for a softer perspective.
Please finish, Tom. I want to hear your thought on this.
You can bring it, Tom, but we'll get the other side. We'll get the other side of the spectrum too.
So it is true that if you are only taking a benzodiazepine for acute anxiety once, say a month, the likelihood of you having the serious side effects secondary to that medication drop substantially. One of the things that I always tell my clients is pills don't teach you skills. And so if there are parts of your life that are creating stress and your body's telling you, my life is under stress and I'm experiencing it in this way, then it's really useful to identify, often with working with a coach, what is it about my life? I might be kind of blind to my stressors because I'm so used to just kind of marching through life with all the oughts and the shoulds of how I'm supposed to do things. And I find myself with a racing heart and a racing mind and feeling dizzy, and I don't know why. I was just trying to get things done.
Mhm.
And a coach might say, okay, what were you trying to get done? And this list is so long, and the coach is sitting there like, oh no, like you are taking on the whole world. And so let's talk about how you might pace things differently and get to know yourself. And you might have higher limits than most people, but you're still pushing yourself to those limits. There's lots of different ways that we might look at that. The trap people get, and this happened a lot, unfortunately, with a lot of the veterans I worked with in the Department of Veterans Affairs, who often who had experienced very extreme events during deployment, is when they would have benzodiazepines prescribed to them and they'd use them regularly. They already had a difficulty sleeping, and benzodiazepines disrupt sleep architecture. And so then your sleep gets increasingly poor, and with increasingly poor sleep, your ability to use your regular coping mechanisms throughout the day shifts. And so then you find yourself then more easily pushed in to the direction of anxiety, and you have this kind of feedback loop that happens that's quite heartbreaking.
So Tom has done a great job, and I'm thankful of laying out some of the pitfalls and things we want to watch out for. No, that's good. It's good to know. Amy or Jennifer, does one of you want to tackle some of the benefits that people can experience with medication?
Yeah, so one thing I've noticed is when I often have people reaching out for therapy at the same time that they've been given a medication prescription. They're saying their doctor has said, here's a prescription, would also benefit from therapy. And so they're starting the process with prescription in hand, wondering if they should take it. And so, at that point, they've already had a physical examination, they've had blood work, the doctor's kind of ruled other things out, and they're just wondering if they should start. I meet them where they're at. If they have hesitancies, I'm saying, okay, here are some things we can begin working on. What would you like begin shifting in your life? And start talking through what some of those things are. Other times they say, I'm going to start it now. We'll see where it goes. So I may say to them, if you notice you're starting to feel better, I ask that you commit to this process, weekly for the next, 2 to 3 months. Like, give this time to a commitment and see how that goes. Because what I know is we can talk through some of the stressors that led them to wanting to get a prescription to help with the symptoms that they're having. Because like Tom said, the skills go along with it. Medication in combination with coaching and coping skills are going to be more beneficial to the individual than just medication alone.
Yeah, I'll add also that I think all of those are true. Sometimes people might be like, just give me a quick fix. I want the pill. And I appreciate Tom kind of adding kind of what the potential side effects could be. I've seen kind of also the flip side where I'll be working with someone for months or years and where they're making amazing progress. They're doing a great job. But for some reason, there's this stigma around taking medication. They're just like, I don't want to put anything into my body. Just keep giving me more tools. I think that's, again, it's not for them any failure in terms of the progress that they're making in therapy, but that it's a helpful additional tool actually to put into their toolkit. Is something that could help them. It feels like, okay, like someone I've worked with who has a fear of flying, for example, and like we talk about distractions, we talk about like, relaxation techniques, kind of exposure, all these things. But maybe sometimes the medication is what's going to give it some traction. I like to think of it as like, wearing glasses. Sometimes people are like, I'm fine, I don't need glasses. I might crash into walls or not be as efficient in what I need to do. But if we get the glasses, if there are certain medications that work for us that help these tools kind of work, that might actually be most helpful for us.
Thank you. So I honestly, this has been so great, and I feel like we could just keep talking. There's a couple other questions that I want to make sure that we spend some time on. One of them is somebody said, can you address some of the stigma that's attached to mental health difficulties, especially in the faith community? So granted, I am the pastor on the panel, but I would love it if one of the three of you would at least start that conversation.
Yeah, so I don't mind jumping in there. It's interesting because someone who has grown up in faith and believes that they could pray their way out of their symptoms may come into therapy initially later in life, and kind of like a first step, saying I need help, and there's, I would say I consistently see some guilt and shame attached to that of well, maybe I didn't pray hard enough, or maybe what is wrong with me that I'm not being healed in this, and that's
faith.
I don't have enough faith, and that's not the case at all, but they may come in with that kind of preconceived notion. Yeah.
I feel like our culture in general, and also maybe our faith specifically too, that if we kind of attribute kind of negative emotions as a bad thing, I'm sure Amy probably has experienced this even with kids, right? We're like, don't be sad, don't be angry. Like we try to like take away the negative emotions. And I think same thing, it's like, especially in the church, right? I think we feel like, oh, like you're just not praying hard enough, or that kind of thing. But kind of turning actually to the Bible and recognizing like that look at Jesus, right? Like Jesus experienced strong emotions. Thinking about the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's like, I'm experiencing great despair and sorrow, even to the point of death. And so kind of recognizing that it's not something that we should feel a sense of shame or guilt for experiencing these emotions. Or I'm sure it was talked about during the grief workshop, right? I mean, there's going to be situations that we experience where we're naturally going to feel sad and depressed, right? When we lose something or someone close to us.
I think again, my own personal experience in many ways, I'm very self-sufficient, very independent, very stubborn, and there's kind of this belief that I should be able to kind of like pull myself up by my bootstraps, and again, there is a lot of kind of faith, I would say like a Western faith tradition, like the Puritan work ethic, that reinforces that basically we should be able to like labor and grind our way to health and salvation. And my experience, my deeply painful personal experience, is that's just simply not true. And I can say this with no guilt and no pride. If anybody could like fix themselves just through like grit, it would have been me. And I couldn't do it without a coach. I couldn't do it without support. I mean, one of the other foundations of Christian faith is that you need other people to achieve what you want to achieve. None of us can be all that God would want us to be on our own. And so for me, that looked like a lot of different things. It looked like a huge support system, but it also looked like getting a life coach, getting a therapist who has helped me tremendously. Why do you think there is a stigma attached to someone who's struggling with mental health?
I think Jennifer touched on it, but that at some point in our environment, we learned that certain emotions and feelings weren't acceptable. So anger, like she mentioned, or even sadness, that, crying's not okay for, some people. So you begin to shove that down and think it's not something that you're able to talk about, or especially talk, to anyone outside of your home. If you grew up in an environment that, family takes care of themselves, and, you have what you need within that context. There's different things that contribute to that thinking going into it.
I think there's also this part of when somebody presents with symptoms of anxiety and depression, and they're kind of really stuck. And the community members try to do something to help, and it doesn't help. That either means one of two things: you're not good at helping, or they're not helpable. And it's always easy to point the finger that way than this way. And so I think the discomfort we have with not knowing what to do sometimes with people, and these are often people we care about, but we feel stuck when we try to help them sometimes. And I think that makes it easier to just place it on that's their problem. And because if I sit with this, I actually come to understand how hard it is for me to deal with this in the moment. And I think that's a really hard place to be.
That's a really helpful point, Tom. Thank you for that. So I'm going to say we're getting close to wrapping this up. If you have any questions that we haven't yet addressed and you want to type those in, we still would like to take another minute or two if we can. But as people are doing that, I wanted to ask panelists, is there any ground that we haven't covered that you feel like, hey, I wouldn't want to get off this panel without having the chance for people to hear X, Y, or Z?
Well, I think since I was so hard on drugs, what I'd like to say is that I'm not a staunch anti-drug. I'm staunch anti-not monitoring the effect of drugs and both the costs and the benefits. I think that's one thing. I also have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder because I've worked with clients for months where they did lots of hard work, building skills, changing their relationships for the better, developing new routines and healthy habits. And they're doing well and they're kind of graduating from needing coaching. And I say, so how do you think things went? And they said, well, I think that pill helped me a whole lot. And I'm like, but what about, I want you to remember the work you did, because if you get stuck, if you find yourself getting stuck again, I want you to remember that there was this process you engaged with a coach that helped you build skills and work on your relationships and manage stressors and build healthy habits. And if you don't attribute any of that work to your progress, then I'm really afraid that life is going to throw you more curveballs, because it throws all of us more curveballs, and you won't rely on some of those tools you picked up to help you problem solve in the future.
Good. That's good. I appreciate that. And one of our panelists even talked about the importance of working with your doctor on medications. It's a whole mental health isn't just mental. I mean, it encompasses every aspect of your life. And if we isolate it to simply the chemistry of the brain, I think we end up missing a tremendous opportunity and kind of setting ourselves up for failure.
And we often do the disservice to the physician of not monitoring things very well. And so they're kind of, they're often in the position of kind of feeling or hearing about how you did today rather than the last 3 weeks and seeing patterns. And so really the more you can do to paint a more full picture for them will be how much better they'll be as a coach for you on the medication side.
We had an attendee ask specifically about COVID, that it's been a very, very difficult time for many people. Isolation, boredom, fear. Any thoughts specifically about how, how we can engage in the era of COVID-19?
I think, well, sorry, one thing that comes to me is that we do need to look at what our goals are, and sometimes we need to adjust those for what they were pre-COVID and what they are now. That it's okay to be a little off on our timeline, because what we're going through is something we could have never anticipated, and we're getting a lot of information that we're trying to process through and make decisions on our own. And so if we do feel like we've kind of taken a step back from some of the things that we had hoped for, just recognizing that we can reevaluate those things, and that's okay to do.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that. I think it's okay to recognize that normal is fluid. So we don't want to look back like how do we get back to our normal life or whatnot. That things could look different, and how do we recalibrate to that? Like we talk about social connection. Like we're so used to spending time going out and doing things with our friends. Maybe that's going to look different. We talk about thinking creatively, Tom. Like now we're playing games virtually rather than in person, or that like now the responsibilities of working and then having children. Some people have their kids at home, right? And you're trying to teach them too, and recognizing that what we are doing is going to look different and not be so hard on ourselves.
Yeah, and again, one of our attendees mentioned the information overload that we're experiencing in the midst of COVID, and that can lead to anxiety. I think there's a practical step of saying I'm going to limit my information intake, like as a practical step towards personal health. I'm going to limit the amount of time that I'm on a news website or scrolling through my social media.
Yeah, especially we're in it deep enough now to like at the very beginning, kind of catching every update was really part of getting kind of up to speed with what's happening and what our response is going to be. And we're at a totally different phase now. And so this is one of those things that might have felt adaptive in the beginning. If we keep doing that pattern, it's actually not as adaptive anymore. Instead, it can actually be something that keeps us trapped in much more of a worry loop where we're kind of like reading articles that are saying the same thing over and over and over again, and pacing your media diet. We're like, no, I'm going to do my checkup and I'm going to see what's going on for this amount of time. And that's what I do to stay informed, is a healthy shift to make at this point.
We have one of our attendees that's asking specifically about how to handle bipolar disorder. That's a big topic. It's a big topic, and I think maybe what I'm going to ask is that we address that offline. But I wanted to say at least that we've seen your question, and I appreciate that is a difficult place to be, but it's almost probably its own conversation for us. But I'll reach out to you personally tomorrow, and we can talk about some resources that are available for you. So we have been going for 75 minutes nonstop, and I honestly feel like we could probably go for an additional 75. The questions are still rolling in, but out of respect for our panelists and for our attendees, I'm going to bring this to a close. A couple just things to keep in mind: that we are going to send out a list of resources, both local therapists, and then hopefully maybe panelists. We can come up with some books that specifically address anxiety or depression that people could pursue on their own. And we'll send that out this week to everybody that was on the panel. The email that's going to come out is also going to include a recording of this. And so if you have somebody in your life that you think this would be a helpful conversation for them to check out, you can forward it and they can watch it. Or if you just can't get enough and you want to watch this whole thing a second time, you can feel free to do that. So again, I want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists, and Jennifer has agreed graciously to close us in prayer, so let's do that.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time of an intentional time to help us better understand just mental health and emotional well-being. Just help this information just marinate as we process it and reflect on how some of this can be affecting us or those that we love. We ask that you also work in our hearts to take away any sense of shame or guilt if we experience any of these things, and recognize that we can not only lean on you, but that you have also brought forth a lot of great resources that we can turn to, particularly community and connection, and whether it's us reaching out for those we care about and seeing them going through this, or us trying to reach out to the others to help us in a difficult time in our lives. We just ask that maybe this would be the starting point for a lot of folks. Just help guide us in what those next steps might be, what that might look like. And we just lift up all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Well, again, panelists, thank you so much. Appreciate you taking time out of your evening. And I hope all of you, as well as our attendees, I hope you have a great rest of the week.
Thank you. Bye.